Welcome back, everyone. The breakout sessions covered a real range of topics, and I hope you enjoyed them. We'll move on now to an important topic for all PRI signatories, namely the updated reporting framework. To introduce the session, please welcome COO of the PRI, Graeme Griffiths.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us at the PRI Digital Forum Americas. Today's session will be focused on the new PRI Reporting and Assessment Framework, which we recently launched on our website. As you can see on this agenda slide, we'll start today's session with a quick recap of the Reporting and Assessment Framework evolution, and then we're going to move into the main objectives of the Reporting and Assessment Review and how we develop the framework in order to achieve these objectives. We're then going to go through the key changes in the new framework and finally dedicate the majority of our session to a Q&A format where we'll answer a few questions that we've received from signatories over the past several weeks. Just moving on to this next slide, why did we review the Reporting and Assessment Framework? Well, as you can see here, we committed to undertake an extensive review of the reporting framework as part of our 10-year blueprint. And the review of the framework will support many of our blueprint actions, but in particular, it's designed to supporting investors incorporating ESG issues, showcasing leadership and increasing accountability, convening and educating responsible investors, driving meaningful data through markets, and championing climate action. Since the launch of the PRI in 2006, we've grown into the largest global responsible investment reporting initiative. Reporting and assessment has gone from a simple self-assessment survey, which was first developed in 2006, when we only had about 100 signatories at the PRI, to a complex reporting and assessment framework, which first launched in 2012, that looked at how PRI signatories were incorporating ESG in their investment decisions. Since then, the framework has been updated over the years to respond to the market evolution and to the growth of our global signatory base. The complexity of the former framework and the quick advancement of the responsible investment market has resulted in the need for a comprehensive review of PRI reporting and assessment. And we therefore developed a framework that is now focusing on the depth of ESG incorporation in investment practices. So, about the main goals of the reporting and assessment review. You can see here that the review has taken place over the last couple of years and has seen the participation of many PRI signatories through two formal consultations. To ensure that the reporting framework reflects the feedback that we've collected from signatories and meets the overarching goal of driving positive change in the investment market, we've developed the new framework following three guiding principles. The new framework, first of all, has evolved and now has more challenging reporting requirements. It's simpler, shorter, and more consistent, and delivers improved and more flexible outputs. And in this session, we're going to focus on the first of those two guiding principles. So moving on to this next slide. So all of the modules of the new reporting framework have been designed to be simpler, shorter, and more consistent. We introduced the Core and Plus model with the aim of simplifying the whole process. Core indicators are mandatory to report on, they're publicly disclosed, and they are assessed. Plus indicators are voluntary to report on, they're voluntary to disclose, and they're not assessed. And this mechanism is put in place of the 5 indicator types that were seen in the old framework. You may remember gateway, peering, core assessed, additional assessed, and descriptive, as well as 3 different indicator characteristics: mandatory to report and disclose, mandatory to report and voluntary to disclose, and voluntary to report and disclose. Signatories will find fewer indicators and sub-indicators with respect to previous years. In fact, overall, signatories will find that the number of indicators and sub-indicators has been cut roughly in half. We grouped indicators that would be applicable to most of the asset classes in the investment and stewardship policy module to reduce repetition, thereby also reducing the reporting burden for signatories. And we removed indicators that were largely descriptive and geared towards what signatories are doing rather than how. So on this next slide, you can see that to better reflect the current state of the responsible investment market and to better showcase the range of responsible investment practices in the industry, the new reporting framework and assessment methodology will be more rigorous, more challenging, and more consistent between modules. We will assess a greater portion of the indicators with respect to previous years. We will focus on the depth of activities or the assets under management coverage of the responsible investment practices of an organization, and on how robust and consistent the ESG incorporation processes are. On this next slide, you can see that the whole content of the reporting framework has been overhauled to make it more relevant, yet signatories will recognize many of the same themes in the new framework that were covered in the former one. Here are a few key changes that I would like to highlight. First, the PRI will require signatories to accompany their report with a senior leadership statement signed by a chief level or C-level member of staff of the organization. The objectives of having a senior leadership statement are to raise awareness and accountability of signatory reporting, to encourage the internal use of the report for decision-making and learning purposes, and to make the report more accessible by third parties that want to learn more about an organization's general responsible investment beliefs. We've also integrated stewardship throughout the reporting framework, therefore. Stewardship will no longer have a separate score, but will feed into the assessment of each of the asset class specific modules. To avoid repetition, the majority of questions on stewardship, especially related to engagement, are in the firm level module investment and stewardship policy section and are aligned with the latest PRI guidance, Active Ownership 2.0, the evolution stewardship urgently needs. Second, the climate change related indicators that were mandatory to report on for the first time in 2020, namely climate strategy and governance, will continue to be mandatory in the new reporting framework. These will form a part of the core section, and therefore the answer options will be more close-ended, and the responses to those indicators will be also publicly disclosed as part of the assessment. Questions related to risk management and metrics and targets will be part of the plus section, therefore voluntary to report and not assessed in 2021, with the aim to make those sections core in 2022. In addition, the introduction of a few new sustainability outcomes indicators in the core is to capture how signatories assess and understand sustainability outcomes and how signatories may be measuring those outcomes. And in addition, a new plus module will capture what the sustainability outcomes of investments are. Moving to the asset class level, the new reporting framework modules will allow signatories to differentiate their practices depending on different strategies or sub-asset classes. As an example, in the listed equity module, you'll be able to differentiate between passive equity, active quantitative equity, active fundamental equity, investment trusts, REITs, and similar publicly quoted vehicles. Finally, we've introduced a new threshold for completing an asset class module. From 2021 onwards, it will be mandatory to complete an asset class specific module for signatories that either invest more than 10% or $10 billion or more of their assets under management. And if signatories instead use external managers for their responsible investment in an asset class, they will need to report on this in the external investment manager selection, appointment, and monitoring, or SAM module. Now we'll move into the Q&A session, where we'll answer some of the questions that we've received in the past several weeks from PRI signatories. I'm delighted to welcome Brian Minns, who's Vice President Sustainable Investing of Addenda Capital and co-chair of PRI's Reporting and Assessment Advisory Committee.
Thanks, Graeme.
Also delighted to welcome, also delighted to welcome Elina Rolfe, PRI Director of Reporting and Assessment.
Hi, thanks, Graeme.
So Brian, I'd like to kick off with you, if I may. Perhaps I could ask you why you think it was important to embark on the review of the reporting framework.
Sure. Well, thanks, and thanks again for having me here today. I think you kind of went through a bit of that in the beginning with your presentation there, especially at the outset when you talked about the development of the PRI's 10-year blueprint. I think that was an important catalyst. I think that really helped kind of set the direction, obviously, where the PRI itself is going, but how reporting and assessment had to evolve in order to support that vision as well. And so I think there's a few different bits and pieces in there I could pull out specifically, but So one I would call out is internal benchmarking. You know, that's a key thing that we hear from other signatories through the Reporting and Assessment Advisory Committee, but also as a signatory ourselves, that being able to benchmark and look at our own performance and see how we're improving year on year is crucial. And so we have to make sure that it maintains and keeps that role. But in order to do that, we have to reflect the evolution that's been happening in responsible and sustainable investing. A lot has changed in the last 10, 15 years. So we need to make sure that the reporting and assessment framework reflects those changes and is able to capture all the different things that our signatories are doing now and what they might be planning to do in the future. And also push signatories a little bit. So not just capture sort of the baseline of what many signatories are doing, but make sure we can try to incorporate what the leading signatories are doing and sort of provide that ability for leaders continue to push the boundaries and then lift up all the other signatories as well. And in particular, I call out the topic of climate change as being an important topic that we need to continue to bring to the fore. So I think it's very clear that we as investors need to spend more time trying to address this crisis and put more effort into it. And we know that our stakeholders want to know more about what we're doing with regard to climate change. And so by incorporating additional required disclosures in the framework, I think that's going to be a step in the right direction, which is going to help with accountability as well, which is another important point. So that's something that we have often heard, be it again through the committee that we're on, or just through discussions with other signatories. But the idea of accountability and that signatories signing the PRI means something, and that through this reporting and assessment mechanism, we can have some accountability and people can hold us to account for our actions in those areas. And I think I'd close on one last one from an asset owner perspective. I think the reporting and assessment needed to evolve and help the asset owner side sort of get the right information from investment managers as they're thinking about the selection of investment managers, as they're thinking about monitoring, but having this additional improved tool in place to help them with those efforts that they're doing was pretty important as well.
That's great, Brian. Thanks so much. Elina, do you have anything to add?
Thanks, Graeme. Yeah, we obviously would echo a lot of things that Brian already touched on. I mean, from a reporting perspective specifically, we've come a long way. You know, we started 2006 with this really basic reporting, which is a self-assessment, essentially asking signatories how well they thought they were following the 6 principles. And then we've come to where we are now. And the current reporting framework really is able to capture whether signatories are doing anything at all, anywhere in their business. And we've come to a place now where that's really not challenging and not enough in a lot of the cases. So we had got to a point where just raising the bar in terms of assessment wasn't really meaningful, because we would be doing that for the wrong reasons, to ensure that the scores are sort of more averaged out, when that's not necessarily the way to do this. So we really needed to look at everything in as a whole package, as it were, and review the questions and the framework as well as the assessment, to ensure that we're incentivizing the right practices, essentially.
Okay, that's great. Elina, I'm going to stay with you. So can you tell us a bit about how the PRI did the review of the reporting framework? Sure.
How long do we have? So we started with a consultation. We went to all the signatories and asked sort of what's working and what isn't working. So we really wanted to understand what are the benefits and strength of our reporting framework, how signatories are using it, and what are the areas that we need to focus for improving. So that was really a useful exercise. We also, in addition to that, we did 17 workshops in 15 different cities when those were allowed in person. And that was really useful to understand the context of the feedback we were receiving, because we were able to talk to our signatories in these sort of roundtable discussions to understand where our signatories are coming from. So that was a useful starting point. So that then allowed us to come up with a proposal, sort of high-level concept of how we would want to address the new reporting framework, together with the Reporting and Assessment Advisory Committee, and also getting a directional steer on the board. Then we went out to consult with our signatory base earlier this year again to sense check that approach, that high-level proposal, and just to see that we're going in the right direction again. So that was the next step. And then we worked with our specialist teams at PRI here really closely to ensure that reporting reflects current best practice in responsible investment and is aligned with the most recent PRI guidance papers. And then the final step was where we had drafted modules that we wanted to test, essentially, with a small group of signatories, so we kind of called it a focus group testing. And what was important there, and you will hear a lot of people say this when it comes to reporting, the devil's in the detail, and it was really useful to be able to not only understand whether the direction is right, but also how some of the sort of new structures and new types of questions are going to be received by our signatories, and what's doable, what's reasonable to expect. So that was really useful because it allowed us to really understand where things are not working and more importantly, why. And learn how we can make that work better. So that was the sort of the final stage before then working on the modules that you can see now online.
Thanks very much, Elina. So clearly it was a very extensive process. Brian, I'm going to come back to you if I may. We've mentioned a couple of times already the Reporting and Assessment Advisory Committee. And I'd really like to ask you as a member of the committee, how RARC has been involved in the review process and how you've provided input into the review itself.
Sure. Thanks, Graeme. So, yeah, so the Reporting and Assessment Advisory Committee, so it's myself and Faith Ward are the co-chairs, but there's, can't remember the exact number right now, but 15 other investor PRI signatory members on that committee. And we've been involved since the beginnings that this review started upwards of two plus years ago. So our main role is to provide feedback and advice throughout the process. So we're not directly involved in by any means in the day-to-day decisions, and that's Elina and her team doing all of that work. But we've been quite involved in, for example, reviewing the results of the consultations that have been done. So the 2018 consultation, the 2020 consultation. Many of the members of the committee also sat in or helped with the roundtables that happened around the world as well. So we were directly listening to and hearing directly from signatories as well. Some of us participated in some of the focus group work that was done in terms of individual modules as they were being developed. So we've been quite actively involved throughout, but our role really is on that advice and the feedback. So helping guide and provide our inputs from a signatory perspective to the staff. But Elina's team obviously has been working very hard on this throughout this entire period of time. It's been a ton of work for them. As I said, dating back at least 2 years. And I think the next year in particular will be also very hands-on in terms of helping signatories through the first year of this, digesting the results that come in. There's going to be opportunities for feedback throughout the process from signatories so we can continuously improve it. Not huge changes, I hope, and I don't think, but I think some incremental changes that can just make it better and better over time, but keeping the new framework in mind. And Elina's team been working with the board, for example, other staff. She mentioned working with the other investment practice teams. That's particularly of interest to make sure that she's extracting and getting the best practice and the best sort of advice on each of those modules. And gathering all that signatory feedback. So it's been great working with her and her team, and I think the committee is excited to see this, the actual that it's now out, and we can start to gather our own metrics and start to think about reporting next year.
Thanks very much, Brian. So it sounds like the advisory committee really did play a very important role in guiding and helping to shape the new framework. I'm going to come back to you, Elina, now with a question around the new mandatory $10 billion assets under management threshold for reporting within given asset classes. Do you want to just talk us a little bit through that very briefly, please? Thank you.
Sure. So this is sort of part of our continuous efforts to increase accountability. So we reviewed our reporting threshold. So a little bit of background. So what we currently have is all our signatories have to report on all their assets, asset classes where they hold 10% or more out of their total and assets under management. So we looked and reviewed at these requirements to see if there's anything else we need to do. And we've established an additional $10 billion threshold. So this will affect only a few and the largest signatories, whereas you can imagine the 10% still represents a very large amount of assets, and sometimes even larger than some of our signatories' total assets under management. So therefore, the impact of ESG incorporation there would still be very relevant, hence our decision to do this.
Okay, thanks, Elina. Brian, I'm going to come back to you. So why do you think it was important to introduce sustainability outcomes in the new reporting framework?
Sure. I think, I think it's a very important development that we're starting the journey to move on from a focus on policies and practices and thinking more about real world outcomes. I think all the signatories to the principles for responsible investment, we do have or should have the views of what's in the interest of society in mind when we're making our investments. And I think we've started down this journey now, sort of inserting some of these sustainability outcome related metrics and measures in there, largely not in the core section, but just to start reinforce the view that these are important, that the real world outcomes of our decisions matter. And it's not always entirely just about having a good policy and having a good program in place, but we need to think about what that really means for the real world, what that means in terms of an outputs and outcomes sort of perspective as well. We still have the focus on policies and processes now because that's kind of where we're at. That's what people are able to measure and report on. But I think it's an important message that the PRI is sending, is that we need to, as investors, embrace this role that we have in terms of promoting sustainability and dealing with these major challenges that we face as a society.
Thanks, Brian. I'm going to stay on this real-world outcomes theme and ask Elina, what types of questions on sustainability outcomes are included in the new reporting framework?
So we've been incredibly careful approaching this. So we know that this is a difficult thing to do, but we wanted to start with sort of the most logical and sensible sort of steps that would hopefully help signatories start understanding this. So the questions of sustainability outcomes are aligned with PRI's 5-part framework, investing with SDGs outcomes. So there will be only few questions in the core section looking at outcomes, and there will be only process oriented. And these will be looking at the first 2 parts of the framework I mentioned. So this is really looking at identifying sustainability outcomes, so whether a signatory has started looking at it, and then sort of setting policies on sustainability outcomes and how they would be doing that. So we're not looking at all at sort of what actually the outcomes are of somebody's investments at this stage in the core section of the reporting framework. There is a separate section, that's the plus section, so voluntary to report on. If you choose to report on it, voluntary to disclose, not assessed. Most of this is also free text or open-ended questions, so hopefully will provide space for signatories who are keen to try their hand out in how to report on this to really test different approaches. So yeah, all the other questions and outcomes will be in this voluntary section where we're looking at things like setting targets, tracking progress against them, amongst others.
Great, Elina, thank you. So I'm going to stay with you, but move the discussion to stewardship. So perhaps you could tell us why stewardship's been integrated throughout the framework rather than being left as a separate module with its own assessment score.
Yeah, so stewardship, we believe that stewardship good practice is conducted for 2 main objectives. So one being as a core part of ESG incorporation, and 2 being driving outcomes on systemic issues that may go beyond individual companies or investment portfolio. So the new reporting framework structure really reflects that thinking. So you have all the questions that look at stewardship practices that are done as part of the ESG incorporation approach. So those will be all questions that will be asked throughout the different asset class sections. So where you can talk about how you're doing certain things in your separate asset class parts of your business. And then the questions that are looking at how you're using stewardship as a tool, really, to shape outcomes. So these will be questions really in the outcomes part mostly. So while those a lot of them are really looking at processes, particularly in the outcomes section, we expect some leading answers to focus on the role of stewardship in shaping outcomes in the context of specific targets, like I mentioned before, and will be aligned strongly to the PRI's Active Ownership 2.0 framework as well.
Great, Elina, thank you very much. So staying on the what's new theme, I'm coming back to you, Brian. I wanted to ask about the senior leadership statement. So can you really tell us what you think, or how do you think the senior leadership statement will contribute to raising awareness and accountability of the PRI reporting?
Sure, thanks. So I think there's a couple of different things going on with this statement. So I think it's a great new addition that's going to be helpful for many, many signatories. So many signatories are completing the reporting, the assessment, and filling out all the questions and getting it all together, and then they have varying degrees of oversight and interest from different parts of their organization. I think by having this statement from the senior leadership level and them signing off on it, so it's not a huge undertaking, but I think it'll be great because it will put some focus at a very senior level within organizations on what the signatory is doing from a responsible investing point of view. So, at Addenda, I know that my CEO already reviews the signatory, what we submit. So I'm not too concerned with that myself, but I think other signatories, I definitely know you have varying degrees of engagement after becoming a PRI signatory. And I think this will enhance that engagement at the senior levels within organizations. I think additionally, it's a great it should be a little bit of a much more accessible overview or a summary that people might want to review first. So, we as an investment manager are now often asked for our reporting. So our clients or prospects want to see our reporting to the PRI. But I think it will be helpful to have this sort of summary type statement built into the front end of those reports that we share with our stakeholders, because it will help sort of provide some of the context, have a bit of forward-looking view as well, and it will help us in our communication with our stakeholders. So I think it'll be quite helpful in a couple of different regards.
Brian, thanks for those perspectives. Let me bring in Elina, actually. Maybe, Elina, you could share some thoughts on the type of content of the senior leadership statement.
Sure. So we've split it out into two sections, and one is really to look at what kind of signatory organization it is. So it's really to frame, provide context to signatories following reporting, sort of introducing the organization, and it's covering signatories' responsible investment beliefs, responsible investment approach, and governance on responsible investment, accountability. And the second section will cover sort of the news and what's changed over the past year, what's new, highlight any responsible investment achievements for the reporting year. So hopefully it will be a really interesting and useful resource for the readers as well.
Great, Elina. I'm going to stay with you. So how can signatories compare their assessment scores with previous years? And since the reporting framework is more challenging, is it likely that scores will be lower than previous years?
Yes, so that's kind of the aim, really. We all know that the assessment at PRI has been kind of growing on average over the years as the practices become more and more mainstream, and kind of hence the need to review the reporting framework in the first place to some extent. We would definitely want to emphasize that comparison is not meaningful, and we shouldn't attempt to do that. The reporting framework is pretty much rewritten, redesigned, so it's going to be quite hard to compare it in sort of any meaningful way. Plus, to emphasize this, we're also aiming to launch the assessment in a way that's just in a different way. So we will know that the seasoned reporters will know that signatories would receive letters, so from A+ to E. So we are changing that, and we will be presenting scores in different format to kind of emphasize or discourage people from trying to compare them. We're assessing more indicators than before. We're looking at the depth of assets under management, coverage of practices. We also are moving away from star, sort of a 3-star point system per indicator. So we're looking at points-based system with indicator weighting. And we're also going to be looking at potential to recalibrate scoring annually and gradually to gain a normal distribution of scores. As before, there will be no overall organizational score, so signatories will receive a score on each module applicable to them. But in all the other ways, it's going to be a very different output.
Okay, so very different need for recalibration and a different system to signal the change. Elina, I'm going to stay with you. What about the reporting outputs? How are they going to change?
So they will look different. We're using different tools and different systems and platforms, but the concept remains the same. We will be providing signatories with their public responses, their private responses, and their assessment outputs or assessment reports. Assessment reports will continue to be completely confidential. So that's kind of, will be similar to what you've been receiving so far. But I think the main point really to emphasize here is that we've tried really hard to in this exercise to rebalance the inputs and outputs. So we know, we wanted to create the reporting framework with meaningful questions and more insightful questions, and we wanted to also reduce the reporting sort of length of the reporting and make it smoother, easier. But this is sort of also this here's also work to be done around making sure that the outputs on the other side are useful and insightful. And to some extent, this is driven by the insightful questions that will be driving that, but improved insights that the new questions will provide. But we're also hoping to make outputs more visual and flexible as part of this effort as well.
Great. And how does the Quorum Plus model work? And what's the split between Quorum Plus questions, roughly speaking?
So briefly, Quorum Plus, so we split all the questions in these two sections. The core is mandatory to report. It is mandatory to be public. It's going to be assessed. It's all closed-ended questions, and they are reasonably stable and all completely process-focused. And there's around 70% of the whole reporting framework questions are in this core section. And around 30% of questions are in Plus. And these are questions that are voluntary to report on. If you choose to report on them, it's voluntary to make those answers public. They will not be scored, and there will be a lot of them will be open-ended. Some will be process-focused. Some might actually look at the outcomes themselves, but sort of a very different sort of type of questions there. Worth noting that this ratio about 70% versus 30%, this is sort of looking at the whole reporting framework. This ratio might differ slightly for different signatories because it will depend on which questions and which sections will be applicable to you. But that's kind of roughly the split.
Great. And last question for you, Elina. So how would you recommend signatories go about starting the new reporting process in practice? Yeah,
really important question. So firstly, I would say look at the new modules that are out now. Another one that, you would expect this to come from a reporting and assessment director, but do look at the explanatory notes that we have provided. They are really, I'm hoping they'll be really helpful in understanding what we're asking and why. There's also assessment methodology there, so you'll be able to see that. We've also created short guides for each module, so that will be useful to kind of as a starting point to really understand the main changes and sort of how the modules are structured. I would definitely start with looking at the organizational overview. So as you know, as before, this is basically a module that it's a room with a lot of doors. So this will tell you which doors you will be opening and which modules you will be looking at and reporting on. Note that there will be no pre-population, of course, so the framework is completely new, so that's worth noting. Another one to make a note on probably is the senior leadership statement we discussed earlier. Don't leave this to the last. You will know your internal sign-off processes and governance processes better than anyone else, so just bear in mind that if you get to that at the end, it might be you might have it might take longer to get it signed off. So there will be also a lot of resources on our website, and we continue adding them there. A lot of tutorials and webinars will be added there. So keep looking there as well. So I'm hoping that a lot of the information there will be really useful for all our signatories in preparing for reporting in January.
Brian, Elina, thanks so much for your time. I think that was a really interesting session. I'm sure many signatories found your insights very, very valuable. Obviously, there's been a tremendous amount of work that's gone into this new review. I'm just going to close with a few remarks now, if I may, just to say that the new reporting framework is available in Word and in PDF format on PRI's website, where you can also find other resources such as short guides, FAQs, video tutorials and the like that can help you prepare for the next reporting cycle. And as usual, the reporting cycle will open in early January and run until the end of March 2021. And we'll still be taking and incorporating feedback in 2021 and onwards to ensure that the RNA framework remains relevant and reflects the evolution of the responsible investment industry. There will not be a formal consultation next year, but signatories can provide feedback on the new reporting tool, both at the question level and more generally at the end of their reporting process. Rest assured that the reporting team and our signatory relationship managers will support you during the new reporting process. And if you have any questions at all about reporting, please see our updated reporting pages on our website or get in touch with the reporting and assessment team on reporting@umpri.org or with your regional signatory relationship manager. So that's all from us. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for joining the session. Hope you found it valuable, and over to you, Carol. Thank you.